Race rebels, culture, politics and the black working class. Starting with Chapter 1, he talks about all the struggles of my people during this time and begins with the chapter title We Wear the Mask, denoting how blacks must do what they got to do to survive. The title alone is very telling of the content of the chapter. Black women had a work code that they followed to the letter. It was essential for financial survival. Simply put, they had to stick together and watch each other's back. Because the payments were meager, the women decided to take matters in their own hands, so to speak. While pantoting was regarded as theft by many employers, household workers believed they had a right to take home leftovers, excess food, and redundant or broken utensils for their home use. Kelly, page 19. Today, modern people know almost nothing about the relations between boss and worker. Back then, unfortunately, we know very little about black workplace theft in the 20th century South, and even less about its relationship to working class resistance. Kelly, page 20. Bottom line is, it sounds like they took only what they could without ruffling any feathers. Little has been written about it. That's probably why modern men know little about it. The book mentions the way black people acted around white people who employed them, or maybe all white people. All the while the appropriate grins, shuffles, and yasms mitigated potential punishments. Kelly, page 22. He talks about how black women were considered less violent, so were treated differently than black males. Both black men and women went through very difficult tribulations while just trying to earn a living. That's the understanding I personally got out of this chapter. The entire message of this chapter, it was a complete struggle, and this chapter is chock full of quotes that fit our plight as a conquered people perfectly. Black workers endured some of the most obnoxious verbal and physical insults from white workers, their supposed natural allies. Kelly, page 20. The next one, Chapter 2, is different in the fact that it focuses on what we did about many of these issues. To see what we are made of, in a manner of speaking, the people of the community stood up and did what they could to help their own people. The chapter talks about the churches who held the meetings and came to agreements of actions to take about their current situation. Not only was our meetings religious, political or otherwise, blacks are a very spiritual people, and we brought that to the workplace and the social spaces. And when black working people entered the House of Labor, they brought the spirit, culture, and rituals of the House of God with them. Kelly, page 29. I am a black man, and I have to say, except for the ones who follow New World philosophy, it is still the same way spoke of in the quote. The system opposed the churches for a logical reason. The churches spoke against working for the system. Southern working people were brought together by culture and plight. Even if religious ideology, spiritual values, and gospel music united Southern working class people and offered a moral justification to fight the bosses, Southern black church leaders were, more often than not, hostile or indifferent to organized labor. Kelly, page 42. The title of the chapter is We Are Not What We Seem, alluding to something much deeper than surface-level thinking. As a people, we taught ourselves over time to dress ourselves in a particular way as to mask our status in this society. I still see my people spending an excessive amount of money on clothes and vehicles, so the program stuck. It might help us in some situations, but it hurts us in others, namely financial. Chapter 3 is about the battlefront of public transportation and the way it was used to strengthen blacks in politics and in turn society. With the title Congested Terrain, it is suggestive of the way people spoke on these trolleys, very to the point, straightforward and blunt. Naturally, tensions will rise in those situations, though the subject matters were touchy in some respect. I'm sure there was more talking than violence, even though violence in these situations has been talked about. The interactions became known as moving theaters on public transportation. These daily battles on public transportation have enormous implications for the study of African American working class opposition. Kelly, page 56. The chapter goes on to talk about how the vehicles used by public transportation was perfect for these interactions because of the way they were set up. In some ways, the design and function of buses and streetcars rendered them unique sites of contestation. Kelly, page 57. The interactions were heated and fueled by injustice to the African American people. The movement was headed by black women, but all were involved. Violence happened as a result of these interactions. Rare, but nonetheless existing. A transgressive act led to violence. which was surprisingly commonplace on Birmingham City Transit System. Kelly, page 58. It was not only these interactions that caused violence, because sometimes whites were violent for lesser reasons. For example, 2 months later on a North Bessemer streetcar, a black man loaded down with luggage was beaten severely for not moving fast enough for the conductor and for cursing. According to the official report, operator hit him with his fist and knocked him out of the car. Kelly, page 58. With these incidents taking place without any public disturbance or conversation, I'm not surprised my people used the same platform for speaking against injustice. Called Birmingham's Untouchables, Chapter 4 discusses the plight of poor black folks in Birmingham, Alabama. Obviously, it's not so much that they poor, it's that they were poor in the age of civil rights. African Americans were at war at home for their civil rights and at war overseas for World War II. As World War II came to a close, African Americans in Birmingham and other southern cities found that the war at home was far from over. The streetcars and buses might have been a little quieter, but that had to do with more vigilant policing on public transportation. Kelly, page 78. Birmingham itself suffered a drop in employment by almost 70% according to Robin Kelly. Birmingham experienced an industrial decline and an expansion of black poverty and unemployment after the war. During the 1950s, 7 out of every 10 black miners in Birmingham lost their jobs, in part because Birmingham steel companies began importing higher-grade ore from South America, which replaced scores of black underground workers. Kelly, page 79. It became so bad that the community was devastated with homelessness and poverty. The city's solution for the crises was to build housing projects. Although the city instituted a massive slum clearing program which left thousands of African Americans homeless, its public housing projects fell far short of fulfilling the housing needs of poor blacks. Kelly, page 80. The city decided to incorporate more types of housing for impoverished blacks. Thus, during the 1950s, Birmingham's displaced, jobless or underemployed black workers were forced to reside in the housing projects. 2 family-style shotgun houses, dilapidated apartments. Kelly, page 81. I mean, these people were poor. There is a phrase used in my family that goes, beggars can't be choosers, because they have to take whatever they can get. Chapter 5 takes a turn because it starts to delve into the mind state of African Americans a little deeper. It starts to talk about the African Americans that searched out other ideologies other than the ones handed to them since birth, such as African American communist and the politics practiced in the black neighborhood in general. Black nationalism became a hot topic of discussion among those who mattered, accompanied by poems and stories about the struggle itself, like the poem Exhortation by J. Thompson, which is highlighted at the beginning of the chapter. Black nationalism became an entity at the same time American communism was spread its propaganda, which also influenced the southern black population. These kinds of creative expressions of black nationalism became less anomalous and more persuasive, particularly in communist publications geared toward the African American community. Kelly, page 104. Some people even gave credit to the Communist Party for some of the ideologies used by the African American community. African Americans who joined the party in the 1920s and 1930s were as much the creation of American communism as of black nationalism, as much the product of African American vernacular cultures. Kelly, page 105. They both had an influence on the community according to Robin Kelly. The most interesting part of this read to me was the introduction of the ABB, the African Blood Brotherhood. They call them radicals, but I think of them as just people who wanted their freedom. Perhaps the most enigmatic of group among the post-war black left was the African Blood Brotherhood, AB, a secret, underground organization of radical black nationalists led largely by West Indian immigrants. Founded in 1918 by Cyril Briggs. Kelly, page 106. Sometimes it is necessary to drop comforts and fight for what is righteous. Chapter 6 has to do with African Americans' love for Africa. The title is This Ain't Ethiopia, but it'll do, and starts with a poem that really made me think, written by Langston Hughes. All you colored peoples, be a man at last, say to Mussolini, no, you shall not pass. Langston Hughes, The Ballad of Ethiopia. Kelly, page 123. To me the poem reads like a patriotic anthem to Africa and America simultaneously, because he cast Mussolini in the role of enemy when in reality he was United States enemy as well as Africa. The chapter starts with the inception of Black internationalists. The poem reflected the feelings of the community about Italy's takeover of Ethiopia. Entitled A Ballad of Ethiopia, the poet was referring to an earlier international confrontation with fascism that rocked the Pan-African world, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Kelly, page 123. According to the author, backing Ethiopia in their fight for independence did a lot to bring the struggle to the world stage. The defense of Ethiopia did more than any other event in the 1930s to internationalize the struggles of Black people in the United States. Kelly, page 128. The chapter really emphasizes the Black left and their influence on the politics of the African American community. The author is steady making connections between the Black left and the Communist Party. Oscar Hunter was not the only African American volunteer whose left-wing roots predated his membership in the Communist Party. Kelly, page 128. Chapter 7 is titled The Riddle of the Zoot. It mentions Malcolm Little in the subtitle, which is Malcolm X, and starts with an excerpt from the Malcolm X autobiography. First we solve the riddle of the Zoot, which is short for Zoot Suit. Malcolm X recalled in his autobiography, I'd also acquired all the other fashionable ghetto adornments, the Zoot Suit and conch that I have described, the liquor, cigarettes, the reefers. Kelly, page 162. Malcolm compared his need for the Zoot Suit as a metaphor for his life. He must have seen some sort of connection between the two. Apparently he considered the suit more than just a suit. When he wore he felt like an entirely new person. When Malcolm put on his very first Zoot Suit, he realized immediately that the wild sky blue outfit, the baggy Punjab pants tapered to the ankles, the matching hat, gold watch chain, and monogram belt were more than a suit of clothes. As he left the department store he could not contain his enthusiasm for his new identity. Kelly, page 165. In a way, for the times the people who wore the Zoot Suits were revolutionary in their own way, sort of the way hippies fought in their own way. The Zoot Suiters and hipsters who sought alternatives to wage work and found pleasure in the new music, clothes, and dance styles of the period were race rebels of sorts, challenging middle-class ethics and expectations. Kelly, page 163. So in a way Malcolm X was going against the system before he knew he was. In contrast to the Zoot Suit, which had a positive connection in his mind, the conch had a different meaning. The conch was a refusal to look like either the dominant, stereotyped image of the Southern migrant or the Black bourgeoisie, whose conchs were closer to mimicking white styles than those of Zoot Suiters. Kelly, page 167. I cannot believe that Chapter 8, the last chapter, is speaking on gangster rap in the post-industrial era. I grew up on gangster rap, so the last chapter really piqued my interest. This chapter focuses a lot on the difference between a nigger and an African American. Apparently African Americans are people who hold high positions in industry or corporate situations, while niggers are just the everyday corner store minimum wage type of folk. I can admit that hurt. Not because I feel like the workaday people, but because I always considered us all one people. In other words, nigga is not merely another word for black. Products of the post-industrial ghetto, the characters in gangsta rap constantly remind listeners that they are still second-class citizens. Kelly, page 210. In response to these type of feelings and accusations is lyrics like the ones Robin Kelly put in his book by Ice-T. These lyrics are formed out of pure suffering. I know because I am a rapper, and I know where my lyrics came from, so I can relate to his lyrics due to my similar upbringing. I'm loud and proud, well endowed with the big beef. Out on the corner, I hang out like a horse thief, so you can call me dumb or crazy, ignorant, stupid, inferior, or lazy, silly or foolish, but I'm badder and bigger, and most of all, I'm a straight-up nigga. Ice-T. Kelly, page 165. The reason gangsta rap is in this book because, at the very least, Robin Kelly considers them race rebels. They spoke straight to the point, they didn't pull any punches, and they told the story the way they saw it in their own neighborhoods. After a while the entire country adopted this attitude, and I mean literally the entire country. The author really impresses me with his knowledge of the distant past and his ability to tap into what's going on today. The purpose of this section of the paper is to highlight the ways working-class black people fought the system using their jobs. As Kelly points out, I want my readers to understand how we did it. why we did it, and also the successes and failures of this endeavor. Very interesting read. I don't know much about the rebels of oppression, so it's nice to have learned about some of the ways my people rebelled. It turns out one of them was just being a working class person, which has a quiet dignity to it in itself. The book emphasizes this as one of the ways the copper-colored people of this nation rebelled. The author, Robin Kelley. By 1987 he had earned his master's in African history and doctorate in U.S. history from UCLA. Wikipedia PG-1. As impressive as his educational background is, his career as a whole is arguably more impressive. After earning his doctorate, he began his career as an assistant professor at Southeastern Massachusetts University, then to Emory University, and the University of Michigan, where he was promoted to associate professor with tenure. He later moved to the Department of History at New York University, where he was promoted to the rank of professor and taught courses on U.S. history, African American history, and popular culture. At the age of 32, he was the youngest full professor at NYU. Wikipedia PG-6. He spoke about how blacks fought, and he basically set the tone of the book in the introduction by saying Race Rebels begins to recover and explore aspects of black working class life and politics that have been relegated to the margins. By focusing on the daily lives of African American working people, strategies of resistance and survival, expressive cultures, and their involvement in radical political movements. Kelley. Page 4. Dr. Kelley takes his readers through the entire book, scrutinizing the working class in Black America for the ways they survived. Not only did they fight the system by working within it, they also fought for survival in the same way. As far as black political influence and battlefronts, Dr. Kelley seemingly left no stone unturned. The problem all started when blacks started aspiring to getting jobs occupied mostly by white men. White men started to marginalize the jobs that blacks were able to do. They called these jobs nigger work or nigger labor, and the titles for these positions actually made white men feel better about their own jobs. And in some cases white workers obtained very real material benefits by institutionalizing their strength through white-controlled unions which used their power to enforce ceilings on black mobility and wages. Black workers had to perform nigger work. Without the existence of nigger work and nigger labor, to white workers whiteness would be meaningless. Kelley. Page 31. It was a tough time for the African American in the North American job market. Kelley has a word for this, although I looked up the word and it appears to be a slang term used by a few professional people I've seen. The word is infrapolitics. It is not in any dictionary, but Google offered a slang term definition: the strategic form that the resistance of subjects must assume under conditions of great peril. In other words, infrapolitics is invisible resentment, the hidden transcript, the result of oppressive policies and harsh penalties for disobedience or open criticism. Plant. Page 1. Makes sense, but it would be nice to have an official definition, even though the definition gave me a better understanding of what Dr. Kelley was writing about. The work blacks had to endure was some of the filthiest jobs available. Every job whites did not want to do was given to blacks. This is described in detail in the book's first chapter. First, by racializing the division of labor, it has the effect of turning dirty, physically difficult, and potentially dangerous work into humiliating work. Kelley. Page 31. The last quote helps to show you as the reader the conditions of the work for African Americans during those rocky times. Because they called jobs derogatory names, the jobs became derogatory jobs in a sense. Like any down-and-out people, all hope was not lost. Blacks became opportunists and risk-takers in the face of terrible odds. Furthermore, at the workplace as in public space, the daily humiliations of racism, sexism, and waged work, combined with the presence of a labor movement, embolden workers to take risks when opportunities arise. Kelley. Page 34. The reality of the situation was very harsh and caused African Americans to work even harder to survive, because that was the real necessity. With a new goal and attitude in mind about working, the black community began to organize in ways it did not previously. Black culture began to be shaped from behind a cloak of secrecy and overt neighborhood fellowships. The role that community organizations played in shaping black working class politics, culture, and ideology is much clearer. Grassroots institutions such as mutual benefit associations, fraternal organizations, and religious groups not only helped families with basic survival needs, but created and sustained bonds of fellowship. Kelly, page 38. These organizations helped the black working class by strengthening the bonds between the co-workers, which made for a much better work environment. Ultimately, politics was the cause and possibly the solution, so politics started to become more important to the African American community as a whole. It was important for African Americans to have some sort of organization or unity, so to speak. Politics could at least fix the situations the people were in, possibly, so that's where the people turned. To give you idea of the mind state of my people, I give you this quote. This sort of romantic view of the golden age of black community, an age when any elder could beat a misbehaving child, when the black middle class mingled with the poor and offered themselves as role models, when black professionals cared more about their downtrodden race than their bank accounts. Kelly, page 39. One of the greatest manifestations of strives toward good economic health in the black community came through the churches. Working people built and sustained black churches with their own hard-earned wages. Kelly, page 40. They were able to meet in these churches and make plans to improve the living conditions of the people. As a result of these meetings, they resolved to do something that was in their power to do. The book says, black church members also helped build Southern labor unions, especially during the era of industrial unionism in the 1930s and 1940s. Kelly, page 40. All as a product of the meetings that took place in these churches, other groups of people decided that black people were a good target to exploit politically. In the workplace, in the neighborhood, multiple groups were busy creating their own informants to maintain control of their particular section. To penetrate the other side of the veil, employers, police officials actively cultivated black stool pigeons or informers to maintain tabs on the black community. Kelly, page 52. In this way they maintained power and control over the movements of the black community. The Negroes were compared to communists as far as their ability to be a, if I may use an American colloquialism, snitch. In other words, they believed that stool pigeons can exist in the black communities, and that their reasons for turning informant might be motivated by the same circumstances that led many of Hosea Hudson's comrades into the Communist Party, that is, joblessness and poverty. Kelly, page 52. Other groups of people decided that black people were a good target to exploit politically. In the workplace, in the neighborhood, multiple groups were busy creating their own informants to maintain control of their particular section. Politically, black women were taking the fight to public transportation, using streetcars as their political soapboxes. Yes, they faced opposition with every performance. Men to increase their quality of life. An especially apt metaphor for understanding the character of domination and resistance on public transportation might be to view the interior spaces as moving theaters. Theater can have two meanings, as a site of performance and as a site of military conflict. Kelly, page 56. The good fight was fought on many fronts, from the lofty heights of political organizations to the street corners and public transportation. A phrase I like to say to represent it all is from the hilt to the tilt. I must say I didn't want to write the summary portion, but I enjoyed it. It helped me remember what I read better. I am superbly glad I read this book. It taught me a great deal about the struggle my people went through, and it also teaches me to keep up the good fight. Thank you for watching, and please, like and subscribe.